It is now in America's national interest to stop aggressive naval patrolling 12 miles off China's shores, because if you do that 20 years from now, there'll be aggressive Chinese naval patrolling 12 miles off California's shores. But I think the time has come for the United States to think very hard about a world in which it might become number 2 and China might become number 1. Then surely America's interests change dramatically. And that's why if America wants to see a China emerge that plays by global multilateral rules and processes, the best way it can do so is not by giving speeches or saying eloquent words about how you should preserve the global system. The best way you do it is through your deeds. And here, of course, I'm going to conclude by mentioning briefly the latest episode that has happened in US-China relations, and which is, of course, as you know, is the Chinese decision to set up an Asian infrastructure investment bank, which unwisely the United States decided to oppose. And as you know, and this is in many ways a sign of the times, in the past, a veto by Washington, D.C. would have meant that all the allies would have stood firmly behind the United States, and the United States veto would have held. But even to my surprise, the first country to break that veto was the number 1 ally of the United States, which is the United Kingdom. And that's a sign of the times, that countries are now preparing for a world in which the United States will no longer be number 1. The rest of the world quite often sees the United States acting unilaterally, acting in its own interests, and often at the expense of global interests. And David mentioned that I've been the ambassador to UN twice. I was there. I've served there for almost 10 years. And it's rather tragic to watch in the UN, as I did at first hand, to see that the institutions that were essentially created by the United States after World War II, with the guidance of FDR and Eleanor Roosevelt and all that, these were basically American-inspired institutions which have then been undermined by American policies. You know, as I get older, I get less and less surprised by things, you know, it's quite normal. But one thing that's really surprised me is that on the one hand, the United States has clearly the freest media in the world, the best financed newspapers, the best financed television stations in the world. But I can tell you this, you know, as someone who travels to at least 30, 40 countries a year, when I come to the United States and I go to my hotel room in Charles Hotel and turn on the television, I feel that I've been cut off from the rest of the world. And literally, the insularity of the American discourse is actually frightening. And this is also true, by the way. I mean, I've said this to my friends there anyway in New York Times. This is true of the New York Times. This is true of the Washington Post. This is true of the Wall Street Journal. There is an incestuous, self-referential discourse among these newspaper journalists and so on and so forth. And they reinforce each other's perspectives and end up misunderstanding the world. Because, you know, the one key point I emphasize is that the era of Western domination of world history was a 200-year aberration. It's coming to an end. And as a result of it, you've got to learn to understand non-Western perspectives in the world. And it's actually quite frightening that in many ways I find American intellectuals behind intellectuals, including in Serbia, where I just was, or Greece, or in Istanbul, because they are much more aware of what's happening in the world than most American intellectuals are. I don't know how to solve that problem. But unlike the United States of America, the Chinese do not believe in proselytizing their beliefs. They do not believe that you have to copy or emulate them to succeed. And they also believe that it is far better for people to admire and respect them for their deeds rather than to pay attention to their words. So in a sense, we will have a very different world when the world's number one power in the world is no longer a missionary power in the world. That, you know, if you look back over the longer history of China over the past 2,000 years or so, it's actually surprising how few military adventures the Chinese had overseas. And in general, they have actually, as you know, within the Chinese Confucian ethos, the guy who's a soldier is at the bottom of the value chain. And I want to emphasize, since I come from Singapore, and Singapore and Hong Kong are seen as competitors all the time, it is actually in Singapore's national interest to see Hong Kong thrive and succeed, because we need competition from another city-state, and therefore we can both do equally well. I mean, Singapore will not just survive, Singapore will do very well. Because, you know, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew and the founding leaders of Singapore created some of the strongest institutions in the world in some areas. The quality of mind of the Singapore civil service, I think, is number one in the world. The quality of mind of the Singapore judiciary is also probably number one in the world. The quality of the Singapore military is probably among the top 10 in the world. Singapore's education system is already ranked among the top 3 or 4 in the world. We have the world's best airport, the world's best functioning port. So we have created a whole ecosystem of excellence in Singapore. And with that ecosystem of excellence, Singapore is poised to take advantage of a major historical opportunity that is coming its way, because just as London served the European century and New York served the American century, the one city in all of Asia that is comfortable with all the major civilizations in Asia, with Chinese civilization, with Indian civilization, with Islamic civilization, and also Western civilization, is Singapore. So Singapore is going to become the New York of the Asian century. So it's a great time coming ahead for Singapore. And, you know, you can read in, you know, whatever, Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Economist, there's this constant belief that the best thing that can happen to China is to have a collapse of the Chinese Communist Party and have a democratic system. The one slightly provocative point I'm going to make here is, be careful what you wish for. Because if the Chinese political system becomes more democratic, it could very well become far more nationalist and far more aggressive as a power. And the great paradox here is that the Chinese Communist Party is actually delivering a global public good by restraining Chinese nationalism. And if you didn't have a strong Chinese Communist Party in charge, you might actually get a more nationalist, a more assertive China. And you know, when I first went to China in 1980, there wasn't a single Chinese tourist leaving China. Last year, 100 million Chinese went overseas freely. And 100 million Chinese returned to China freely. Now, if there's no freedom in China, if China was this despotic, oppressive state, would 100 million Chinese come back to China?